Today I would like to read chapter 17 from the first part of Virginia Woolf's novel To the Lighthouse, published first in 1927. I just finished reading this book and I am really taken by it. I think it is a great book, and this chapter in particular I think is one of the highlights of it. We will see the main characters having dinner together, and we will, as it is done in this what they call modernist style of writing, we will read through their thoughts and feelings. We are switching from one person's head to the next in this entire chapter, and I think this is really well done in here. If you have not read Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse yet, which you should, then I just give you a quick recap of the characters, which of course if you have read chapters 1 to 16 of it, you know a little by now. So the main characters that we meet here are a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay. Mr. Ramsay is a professor of philosophy, who has written some renowned works, but is a bit discontent with the realization that probably he has not had and will not have as big an impact on the history of philosophy as he maybe would have dreamed in his earlier life. He has, however, married Mrs. Ramsay, and they have 8 children together. The oldest one is already grown up, and the youngest, I think, at the start of the novel is about 6 years old. So they are getting a little older, the Ramsays. Mrs. Ramsay is certainly a very socially aware person, and we will start with being in her head, and we will be in her head for quite a while in here. So she is organizing all this. What is she organizing? They own a little house somewhere up north in Scotland on the Isle of Skye, I think, and there they are having various guests over. The most important ones that feature here are a gentleman named William Banks. He's about 60 years old and an old friend of Mrs. Ramsay's. He's a widower, and we'll hear about him a little. Then there is Charles Tansley. In my mind, he's in his 20s. He's kind of a graduate student of Mr. Ramsay's, so he's a young philosopher. The children call him already on the first page, they call him the little atheist. He is a very intelligent man, but he's not the most pleasant person to be around. That's Charles Tansley in here. Then there are Paul Rayleigh and Minta Doyle, 2 young people who Mrs. Ramsay has been eager to get together, and it has finally happened now. In this chapter, everyone will sort of learn that they just got engaged, and they have been out to the beach for far too long, which makes Mrs. Ramsay a little mad, or upset at least. They will come a little late for the dinner that we will be here with them. And then there is Lily Briscoe, who is a young woman, a single painter, an artist who has to struggle a little with her art and has to struggle with the fact that some people, including, for example, Charles Tansley, just openly declare that they think that women cannot paint and cannot write. So why is she even doing that? Lily Briscoe will become one of the central characters in the second part of this great novel by Virginia Woolf. So, okay, let's jump right into it, and let's see how all these people and the various Ramsay children in here are having dinner together. It will take about the right time for a nice little dinner of everyone together. I start at the end of chapter 16 and then read all through chapter 17. And we start with Mrs. Ramsay, or Mrs. Ramsay's thoughts. But she stopped. There was a smell of burning. Could they have let the bœuf en daube overboil, she wondered? Pray heaven not. When the great clangor of the gong announced solemnly, authoritatively, that all those scattered about, in attics, in bedrooms, on little perches of their own, reading, writing, putting the last smooth to their hair, or fastening dresses, must leave all that, and the little odds and ends on their washing tables and dressing tables, and the novels on the bed tables, and the diaries which were so private, and assemble in the dining room for dinner. Chapter 17. But what have I done with my life? Thought Mrs. Ramsay, taking her place at the head of the table and looking at all the plates making white circles on it. William, sit by me, she said. Lily, she said wearily, over there. They had that, Paul Raleigh and Minta Doyle. She, only this, an infinitely long table and plates and knives. At the far end was her husband sitting down, all in a heap, frowning. What at? She did not know. She did not mind. She could not understand how she had ever felt any emotion or any affection for him. She had a sense of being past everything, through everything, out of everything, as she helped the soup. As if there was an eddy there, and one could be in it, or one could be out of it, and she was out of it. It's all come to an end, she thought, while they came in one after another. Charles Tansley, sit there, please, she said. Augustus Carmichael, and sat down. And meanwhile she waited passively for someone to answer her, for something to happen. But this is not a thing, she thought, ladling out soup, that one says. Raising her eyebrows at the discrepancy, that was what she was thinking, this was what she was doing, ladling out soup, she felt more and more strongly outside that eddy, or as if a shade had fallen and, robbed of color, she saw things truly. The room, she looked round it, was very shabby. There was no beauty anywhere. She forbore to look at Mr. Tansley. Nothing seemed to have merged. They all sat separate, and the whole of the effort of merging and flowing and creating rested on her. Again she felt, as a fact, without hostility, the sterility of men. For if she did not do it, nobody would do it, and so, giving herself the little shake that one gives a watch that has stopped, the old familiar pulse began beating, as the watch begins ticking. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and so on, she repeated, listening to it, sheltering and fostering the still feeble pulse, as one might guard a weak flame with a newspaper. And so then, she concluded, addressing herself by bending silently in his direction to William Banks. Poor man, who had no wife and no children, and dined alone in lodgings except for tonight. And in pity for him, life being now strong enough to bear her on again, she began all this business, as a sailor, not without weariness, sees the wind fill his sail, and yet hardly wants to be off again, and thinks how, had the ship sunk, he would have whirled round and found rest on the floor of the sea. Did you find your letters? I told them to put them in the hall for you, she said to William Banks. Lily Briscoe watched her drifting into that strange no-man's land where to follow people is impossible, and yet their going inflicts such a chill on those who watch them that they always try at least to follow them with their eyes as one follows a fading ship until the sails have sunk beneath the horizon. How old she looks, how worn she looks, Lily thought, and how remote. Then, when she turned to William Banks, smiling, it was as if the ship had turned and the sun had struck its sails again, and Lily thought with some amusement, because she was relieved, why does she pity him? For that was the impression she gave when she told him that his letters were in the hall. Poor William Banks, she seemed to be saying, as if her own weariness had been partly pitying people, and the life in her resolve to live again, had been stirred by pity. And it was not true, Lily thought. It was one of those misjudgments of hers that seemed to be instinctive and to arise from some need of her own rather than of other people's. He is not in the least pitiable. He has his work, Lily said to herself. She remembered, all of a sudden, as if she had found a treasure, that she too had her work. In a flash she saw her picture and thought, yes, I shall put the tree further in the middle. Then I shall avoid that awkward space. That's what I shall do. That's what has been puzzling me. She took up the salt cellar and put it down again on a flower in pattern in the tablecloth so as to remind herself to move the tree. It's odd that one scarcely gets anything worth having by post, yet one always wants one's letters, said Mr. Banks. What damned rot they talk, thought Charles Tansley, laying down his spoon precisely in the middle of his plate, which he had swept clean, as if, Lily thought, he sat opposite to her with his back to the window precisely in the middle of view. He were determined to make sure of his meals. Everything about him had that meagre fixity, that bare unloveliness. But nevertheless the fact remained, it was almost impossible to dislike anyone if one looked at them. She liked his eyes. They were blue, deep-set, frightening. "Do you write many letters, Mr. Tansley?" asked Mrs. Ramsay, pitying him too, Lily supposed, for that was true of Mrs. Ramsay. She pitied men always as if they lacked something. Women never, as if they had something. He wrote to his mother, otherwise he did not suppose he wrote one letter a month, said Mr. Tansley shortly. For he was not going to talk the sort of rot these people wanted him to talk. He was not going to be condescended by these silly women. He had been reading in his room, and now he came down, and it all seemed to him silly, superficial, flimsy. Why did they dress? He had come down in his ordinary clothes. He had not got any dress clothes. One never gets anything worth having by post. That was the sort of thing they were always saying. They made men say that sort of thing. Yes, it was pretty well true, he thought. They never got anything worth having from one year's end to another. They did nothing but talk, 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 eat, eat, eat. It was the women's fault. Women made civilization impossible with all their charm, all their silliness. "No going to the Lighthouse tomorrow, Mrs. Ramsay," he said, asserting himself. He liked her. He admired her. He still thought of the man in the drainpipe looking up at her, but he felt it necessary to assert himself. He was really, Lily Briscoe thought, in spite of his eyes, but then look at his nose, look at his hands, the most uncharming human being she had ever met. Then why did she mind what he said? Women can't write, women can't paint. What did that matter coming from him, since clearly it was not true to him, but for some reason helpful to him, and that was why he said it. Why did her whole being bow like corn under a wind, and erect itself again from this abasement only with a great and rather painful effort? She must make it once more. There's the sprig on the tablecloth. There's my painting. I must move the tree to the middle. That matters, nothing else. Could she not hold fast to that, she asked herself, and not lose her temper and not argue? And if she wanted a little revenge, take it by laughing at him? "Oh, Mr. Tansley," she said, "do take me to the Lighthouse with you. I should so love it." She was telling lies, he could see. She was saying what she did not mean to annoy him for some reason. She was laughing at him. He was in his old flannel trousers. He had no others. He felt very rough and isolated and lonely. He knew that she was trying to tease him for some reason. She didn't want to go to the Lighthouse with him. She despised him. So did Prue Ramsay. So did they all. But he was not going to be made a fool of by women, so he turned deliberately in his chair and looked out of the window and said, all in a jerk, very rudely, it would be too rough for her tomorrow. She would be sick. It annoyed him that she should have made him speak like that, with Mrs. Ramsay listening. If only he could be alone in his room, working, he thought, among his books. That was where he felt at ease. And he had never run a penny into debt. He had never cost his father a penny since he was 15. He had helped them at home, out of his savings. He was educating his sister. Still, he wished he had known how to answer Miss Briscoe properly. He wished it had not come out all in a jerk like that. You'd be sick. He wished he could think of something to say to Mrs. Ramsay, something which would show her that he was not just a dry prig. That was what they all thought of him. He turned to her, but Mrs. Ramsay was talking about people he had never heard of to William Banks. Yes, take it away, she said briefly, interrupting what she was saying to Mr. Banks to speak to the maid. It must have been 20 years ago that I last saw her, she was saying, turning back to him again, as if she could not lose a moment of talk, for she was absorbed by what they were saying. So he had actually heard from her this evening? And was Carrie still living at Marlow? And was everything still the same? Oh, she could remember it as if it were yesterday. On the river, feeling it as if it were yesterday. Going on the river, feeling very cold. But if the Mannings made a plan, they stuck to it. Never should she forget Herbert killing a wasp with a teaspoon on the bank. And it was still going on, Mrs. Ramsay mused, gliding like a ghost among the chairs and tables of the drawing room on the banks of the Thames, where she had been so very, very cold 20 years ago. But now she went among them like a ghost, and it fascinated her as if, while she had changed, that particular day, now become very still and beautiful, had remained there all these years. Had Carrie written to him herself, she asked. Yes, she says they're building a new billiard room, he said. No, that was out of the question. Building a billiard room. It seemed to her impossible. Mr. Banks could not see that there was anything very odd about it. They were very well off now. Should he give her love to Carrie? Oh, said Mrs. Ramsay with a little start. No, she added, reflecting that she did not know this Carrie who built a new billiard room. But how strange, she repeated, to Mr. Banks' amusement, that they should be going on there still, for it was extraordinary to think that they had been capable of going on living all these years when she had not thought of them more than once all the time. How eventful her own life had been during those same years. Yet perhaps Carrie Manning had not thought about her either. The thought was strange and distasteful. People soon drift apart, said Mr. Banks, feeling, however, some satisfaction when he thought that after all he knew both the Mannings and the Ramsays. He had not drifted apart, he thought, laying down his spoon and wiping his clean-shaven lips punctiliously. Perhaps he was rather unusual, he thought, in this. He never let himself get into a groove. He had friends in all circles. Mrs. Ramsay had to break off here to tell the maid something about keeping food hot. That was why he preferred dining alone. All these interruptions annoyed him. Well, thought William Banks, preserving a demeanor of exquisite courtesy and merely spreading the fingers of his left hand on the tablecloth as a mechanic examines a tool beautifully polished and ready for use in an interval of leisure, such are the sacrifices one's friends ask of one. It would have hurt her if he had refused to come, but it was not worth it for him. Looking at his hand, he thought that if he had been alone, dinner would have been almost over now. He would have been free to work. Yes, he thought, it is a terrible waste of time. The children were dropping in still. I wish one of you would run up to Roger's room, Mrs. Ramsay was saying. How trifling it all is, how boring it all is, he thought, compared with the other thing, work. Here he sat drumming his fingers on the tablecloth when he might have been. He took a flashing bird's-eye view of his work. What a waste of time it all was, to be sure. Yet, he thought, she is one of my oldest friends. I am by way of being devoted to her. Yet now, at this moment, her presence meant absolutely nothing to him. Her beauty meant nothing to him. Her sitting with her little boy at the window, nothing. Nothing. He wished only to be alone and to take up that book. He felt uncomfortable. He felt treacherous that he could sit by her side and feel nothing for her. The truth was that he did not enjoy family life. It was in this sort of state that one asked oneself, what does one live for? Why, one asked oneself, does one take all these pains for the human race to go on? Is it so very desirable? Are we attractive as a species? Not so very, he thought, looking at those rather untidy boys. His favorite Cam was in bed, he supposed. Foolish questions, vain questions, questions one never asked if one was occupied. Is human life this? Is human life that? One never had time to think about it. But here, he was asking himself that sort of question because Mrs. Ramsay was giving orders to servants, and also because it had struck him, thinking how surprised Mrs. Ramsay was that Carrie Manning should still exist, that friendships, even the best of them, are frail things. One drifts apart. He reproached himself again. He was sitting beside Mrs. Ramsay and he had nothing in the world to say to her. "Oh, I'm so sorry," said Mrs. Ramsay, turning to him at last. He felt rigid and barren, like a pair of boots that has been soaked and gone dry so that you can hardly force your feet into them. Yet he must force his feet into them. He must make himself talk. Unless he were very careful, she would find out his treachery of his, that he did not care a straw for her, and that would not be at all pleasant, he thought. So he bent his head courteously in her direction. "How you must detest dining in this bear garden," she said, making use, as she did when she was distracted, of her social manner. So, when there is a strife of tongues at some meeting, the chairman, to obtain unity, suggests that everyone shall speak in French. Perhaps it is bad French. French may not contain the words that express the speaker's thoughts. Nevertheless, speaking French imposes some order, some uniformity. Replying to her in the same language, Mr. Banks said, "No, not at all." And Mr. Tansley, who had no knowledge of this language, even spoken thus in words of one syllable, at once suspected its insincerity. They did talk nonsense, he thought, the Ramsays, and he pounced on this fresh instance with joy, making a note which one of these days he would read aloud to one or two friends. There, in a society where one could say what one liked, he would sarcastically describe staying with the Ramsays and what nonsense they talked. It was worth while doing it once, he would say, but not again. The women bored one so, he would say. Of course, Ramsay had dished himself by marrying a beautiful woman and having 8 children. It would shape itself, something like that. But now, at this moment, sitting struck there with an empty seat beside him, nothing had shaped itself at all. It was all in scraps and fragments. He felt extremely, even physically, uncomfortable. He wanted somebody to give him a chance of asserting himself. He wanted it so urgently that he fidgeted in his chair, looked at this person, then at that person, tried to break into their talk, opened his mouth, shut it again. They were talking about the fishing industry. Why did no one ask him his opinion? What did they know about the fishing industry? Lily Briscoe knew all that. Sitting opposite him, could she not see, as in an X-ray photograph, the ribs and thigh bones of the young man's desire to impress himself lying dark in the midst of his flesh? a thin mist which convention had laid over his burning desire to break into the conversation. But, she thought, screwing up her Chinese eyes and remembering how he sneered at women, can't paint, can't write, why should I help him to relieve himself? There is a code of behavior, she knew, whose 7th article, it may be, says that on occasions of this sort it behooves the woman, whatever her own occupation may be, to go to the help of the young man opposite so that he may expose and relieve the thigh bones, the ribs of his vanity, of his urgent desire to assert himself. As indeed it is their duty, she reflected in her old maidenly fairness, to help us suppose the tube were to burst into flames. Then, she thought, I should certainly expect Mr. Tansley to get me out. But how would it be, she thought, if neither of us did either of these things? So she sat there, smiling.